I'd like to start my remarks this afternoon with two quotations that I want to share with you. The first is about a warlord, and the second is about a governor. In 2003, an official at Human Rights Watch issued the following statement. Human rights abuses in Afghanistan are being committed by gunmen and warlords who were propelled into power by the United States and its coalition partners. These men and others have essentially hijacked the country outside of Kabul. 5 years later, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty published an article. And in that they announced the winner of the first Afghan Person of the Year award. And that award had been selected through a radio call-in competition. And so here was that announcement. Sherzai, governor of Nangarhar, was credited with keeping the peace, eradicating poppy fields, and building an important highway between the capital Jalalabad and Torkham on the border with Pakistan. Now, it might surprise you that actually both of these quotations are about the same man, this individual here, Governor Gul Aga Sherzai. So how is it that a human rights abusing warlord can go on to become Afghanistan's first Person of the Year? Well, this is the question at the heart of my own research, and it's the contradiction or the paradox that motivated me to travel to Afghanistan several years ago to conduct this research. And what I realized was that I couldn't get to the bottom of this contradiction without spending some up-close and personal time with some of these characters. And so that's how in the fall of 2009, I ended up having lunch with the governor at his provincial palace. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not an apologist for warlords. I'm not impressed by their prestige and power, and I'm very well aware of the cost that warlordism has inflicted in Afghanistan. But what I am is a political scientist, which means that I'm interested in what politics is, not what I wish it would be or what it could be. And so it was in that spirit that I set about trying to figure out for myself how it was that some of the country's fiercest warlords had gone on to become some of its most successful governors. So this wasn't an easy question to ask because so much of what we hear about political life in Afghanistan is framed in black and white terms. Fundamentalism versus freedom, poppies versus development, tribalism versus nationalism, civil war versus democracy, and warlordism versus governance. And yet I find these dichotomies not only to be false, but I find them to be dangerous because they misrepresent what life is like in a country that is struggling from civil war, struggling then through a period like Taliban rule, and trying to move in a stumbling fashion towards peace and ultimately towards the resolution of a conflict. For people who live in that country, the space is not black and white, it's actually gray. And what you find in that kind of a gray space is all of these elements interacting with each other, they're bumping into each other, they're colliding with each other, and they're coexisting. And it's in a space like that where you can actually have a man who is both a warlord and a governor. And so this is the reality of what I found Afghanistan to be. And so let's think about why that reality came to pass. In order to do that, we have to go back. We have to go back to September 11th. And so after September 11th, the U.S. military sought out partnerships with various warlord commanders, including Gul Aga Sherzai. And so who were these warlords? Many of them had been members of the Mujahideen. They had fought the Soviets and expelled them from Afghanistan during the Cold War. They dragged Afghanistan into a terrible civil war. And then they were fighting the Taliban on their own for many years before the Americans showed up. So when the Americans came, a partnership was forged between the warlords and the American military. And actually, the campaign to defeat the Taliban was swift and effective. In a matter of months, the Taliban regime was gone. And so then what came next? Well, we had a group of winners, and they wanted to hold on to the spoils of their victory. So if you take a look at this map that globalsecurity.org put together in 2002, you'll see in different colors the blocks of territory that they estimated each of these warlords controlled. So basically, we had the looming threat of the country being carved up into fiefdoms controlled by different warlords. And as you can imagine, this is not the vision that Afghans had had for their political future, and this is not what the international community had had in mind. So what was the solution to this challenge? Well, in an ideal form, which was created in the imagination of the donor community, but also amongst a lot of Afghans that I spoke to when I first went to the country in 2004, it was the construction of a strong and capable central government. And that government would bridge the divide between the capital and the people in the countryside by introducing a new kind of politics. It would be a democratic politics, it would be based in the rule of law, and this kind of politics would be able to deliver goods and services, health, education, and economic development. It would bring security, and it would move Afghanistan into a different kind of politics. Now, for those of us who study how states form, we know that to realize this kind of an ambitious vision requires a certain set of institutions. But Afghanistan at the time had no army, no police, no courts, no judges and lawyers, no bureaucracy to tax and then spend money in order to deliver these services. Instead, what we saw when Hamid Karzai took office was a kind of shell of government. And so while many people hoped that Karzai would in one fell swoop marginalize all of these warlords, instead, when you look back, you see that he took a different approach. He played a kind of game and divide and conquer, and so he pit one warlord against the other, and he brought some close and he pushed others away. And ultimately, in retrospect, what this looks like is a kind of engagement with warlords, right? And part of that engagement involved enticing them into the government with positions. And some of those positions included governorships. And so the two warlords that I was studying were appointed to two of the most important provinces in the country. Nangarhar on the border with Pakistan and Balkh on the border with Uzbekistan. So when I arrived to kind of survey the scene of these warlords, I was trying to understand how to figure them all out. And what became very clear to me was that all warlords in Afghanistan were not created equal. Some warlords were not interested in governing on behalf of the central government, and others were simply incapable. And over time, it became clear to me that there was a kind of what people would call a Goldilocks rule, right, in effect. That there was a handful of just strong enough warlords. They had connections in their communities, socially and politically. And so they could energize and strengthen government and make it real, take something that was just on paper and turn it into a force that actually had some capability, some strength. But they also faced competition. And what did that mean? It meant that they had rivals, other warlords who surrounded them, who threatened their ability to dominate any particular space, right? And so they needed help. If they wanted to become the strongest in town, they needed help, and who could they look to? They could look to the central government for that support. And out of that came a symbiotic relationship in which warlords became governors, and in certain circumstances, they actually were able to create provincial government, and they actually used that provincial government not just for themselves, but also on behalf of the central government in Kabul. So in the time I have left, I wanted to introduce you to a second one of these governors. This is Governor Atta Mohammed Noor. Governor Atta has been at the head of the Balkh provincial government for more than 8 years. He joined the Mujahideen when he was a teenager and fought the Soviets. He then went on to fight the Taliban. And then he went on to join the Americans in 2001 to push the Taliban out of northern Afghanistan. So he came out of that campaign much stronger than he had been before. But he also had rivals. And he understood that if he wanted to be the biggest guy in town in Balkh, then he was going to need some help. So he looked to the central government for that, and President Karzai looked back in the summer of 2004 and appointed him as governor. So for me, what was interesting was not only that this governor, once appointed, was able to consolidate power in a way that he hadn't been before, but he was able to introduce a kind of government that had never existed in this province before. So I want to take you into the black box of how he did that by introducing you to one of his commanders. So I spent time with this commander, and I'm going to leave his name out to protect his privacy. But this commander, by the 2001 period, had been fighting with Atta for a very long time. He was a senior commander of his. And when I met this commander, he had gone into business. He had gone into business with the governor as part of a real estate project. And the real estate project basically involved buying government land on the cheap and then selling it as part of a very profitable residential complex. So this isn't how the governor and his colleagues would describe it, but basically this was a land mafia. Right? So I came back a year later, and this commander told me that he had decided he was going to go into politics, and he had actually run for and won a seat in the local provincial council. So I came back a couple years later, and I saw him again, and this time he invited me to this huge, beautiful mansion that he had built, and he explained to me that he was very happy serving the people in his role as a provincial council member. So why do I tell you this story? Well, I'm telling you this story because there are two ways to read it. One is, this is a governor who used to be a warlord. He takes a commander of his, he looks out for him, he makes him rich through nepotism and cronyism, he gets him a position in the government. This is the kind of corruption that we should expect to see from a warlord. There's a second interpretation, which is mine, which is that this is a strongman governor who uses his most valuable asset, men who fought with him and bled with him for years, and uses that asset and leverages it to consolidate his military power, his economic and political power, and in doing that is able to build a government that's not only loyal to him, but is actually capable of introducing security into a province. It's capable of encouraging private investment and reconstruction. It's capable of enforcing a poppy ban year after year. And it's capable of keeping the insurgency out of the province. So I want to be clear, though, about what I mean when I say strongman governance. Because if you're a trader living under a strongman governor, you're probably paying a lot of bribes. If you're an ordinary citizen and you want to interact with government, you're probably running into corruption at every turn. If you happen to know somebody in the government, you're probably going to be treated better than if you don't. Your district governor may be illiterate, your local bureaucrat may not know what he's doing, and if you happen to cross the wrong person, you may be bringing upon yourself the threat of violence. So this is not democracy, this is not the rule of law, but this is government. This is government that is messy and it's unstable, but it's government that comes into your life in the form of a tax collector, in the form of a policeman who can enforce a ban on the cultivation of poppy, in the form of a paved road that allows you to get your goods to market. It comes in the form of elections, so you can elect your president, your member of parliament, and your provincial council member, and in the form of a provincial palace where you as an elder can go and register your concerns and complaints to the governor. This is, in other words, a government in gray, right? It's suboptimal and it's difficult for the people who live under it, but it's a new kind of order that didn't exist before in two provinces that have suffered greatly from civil war and then under the Taliban government. So I realize that I'm leaving you with a bit of a gray picture, a bit of a gloomy picture, and I thought as a professor at Columbia, I would turn back to one of the great scholars from Columbia, Charles Tilly, late and great sociologist, who in his description of the early rulers of Europe, I think might give us a little bit of perspective. He says, without branding all generals and statesmen as murderers or thieves, a portrait of war makers and state makers as coercive and self-seeking entrepreneurs bears a far greater resemblance to the facts than do its chief alternatives. Now I know that human rights activists and military officers and foreign policy makers and ordinary Afghans did not want to go through this kind of politics again in Afghanistan. They had hoped to avoid it, to skip over it. And yet, as a student of political science, I know that that was an unrealistic expectation. So my conclusion is not to throw up my hands in despair or to walk away from Afghanistan, but is to say that it's really important for us to look at the details, to understand the context, and to ground our foreign policy making not in a fantasy of what we hope things would be, but in fact in a reality of how things actually are. So thank you very much.